is a prolific writer on ethnic conflict, on nationalism. He's a professor, indeed, of international conflict research at ETH Zurich, and he's preparing a major manuscript on precisely the theme for tonight, nationalism and the transformation of the state. The lecture will be published in Nations and Nationalism in due course, where you can read it. And I should say we would welcome too your contributions to either Nations and Nationalism or to the ethnic and racial studies in ethnicity and nationalism. I should say too, there will be no questions after this lecture. It will just be a lecture, but there will be a reception afterwards in the Crystal Macmillan building, and you're very welcome to ask Lars-Erik anything that troubles you or excites you about the lecture. So without further ado, I hand over to Lars-Erik.
Thanks so much. Now, you see the email up there. So if you don't get the chance, you can shoot me an email. Now, I was joking a bit here with John about these twin screens here, which is kind of weird. It reminded me of these twin peaks of the Kilimanjaro and Monte Python. But there is also a joke linked to nationalism about having, and I think, John, you said that we love you so much that we would like to have two Lars-Eriks. But there was actually also a statement made by a French writer, Mauriac, about Germany after World War II. That he said, we love Germany so much they would like to have two. So now I'm going to be a little bit old-fashioned in the way that I give the lecture, since it's also going to be published. I'm even going to read the paper. This was how I was told you could present papers when I spent 2 years in Oxford many years ago. So I'm going to be a little bit more stiff in that sense. I'm not going to be like Steve Jobs jumping around here in the turtleneck and all that. Oh, I see. So this is not working.
Hang on.
I can also have the red box.
Can you hear that?
No.
Switch on the top.
Yeah, because we're on the first row, you know. Yeah, you are. It's good. It's a good English conversation.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, very good. Excellent. So I can start the old-fashioned lecture now. Okay. So it's really a great honor to deliver this Anthony B. Smith lecture. Thank you so much for the invitation. Before proceeding, however, to my main arguments, please allow me to make some personal remarks about Anthony B. Smith. I first experienced the great scholar in the famous Warwick debate in the autumn of 1995. Having just taken up my first regular faculty position at Oxford, I decided to drive up to defend the debate. Already in my dissertation that I had defended the year before, I relied on the work of Smith and his debating opponent, Ernest Genner. He doesn't need an introduction either, I guess. In the debate, it was, of course, Genner's rhetorical brilliance that impressed me the most. Responding to Smith's critique of his radical modernism, Genner stated that the past of nations makes as little difference to their current behavior as do neighbors to human beings. influenced by Geller and constructivist scholarship in political science and international relations, I came to believe that nations' navels were indeed inconsequential. Now, I think I'm going to pause just a little bit to allow people to find their seats. Don't worry, you haven't missed much. So, see that, very good. In contrast, Smith's influence on my own thinking has been much more gradual. As I read more on the history of nationalism, I started having doubts about Gender's radical version of modernism. But it was not until I returned to the classic literature on nationalism during the past decade that I began to re-evaluate the seminal exchange more profoundly. Revisiting the debate, it seems that Gender's sweeping dismissal of the so-called navels of nations came at the cost of a measure of empirical nonchalance. In his opening remarks, Smith insisted that Gender's modernist approach only, quote, tells half the story, end quote. Ever a structuralist, Gellner responded that that would be fine with him, while admitting that, quote, there is a certain amount of navel about, but not everywhere, and on the whole, it's not important, end quote. Ultimately then, the two great scholars were not so much contradicting each other as putting the stress on different aspects of what makes up a nation. In fact, these two competing perspectives were anticipated already in one of the earliest and still most insightful statements on nationalism, namely Ernest Renan's famous lecture, Qu'est-ce que c'est qu'une nation? My paper's right. Okay. So, in which he proposed a definition of the nation based on two components. Quote, one is in the past, the other is in the present. One is the possession in common of a rich legacy of remembrances. The other is the actual consent, end quote. The latter captured by the famous notion of an everyday plebiscite. Modernists, especially of instrumentalist persuasion, tend to cite the latter without mentioning Renan's first component, which included allusions to a heroic past, of great men, of glory, etc. More recently, however, the retrospective logic of nationalism highlighted by both Renan and Smith has been mostly overshadowed by Gellner's modernist interpretation. In the social sciences, it is often proclaimed that we are all constructivists today. Indeed, the nationalism literature's vastness and conceptual maturity may give the impression that very little remains to be said about nationalist politics and its consequences. To this date, the seminal contributions by Gellner, Benedict Anderson, and Eric Hobsbawm, and Terence Ranger, all originally published in the Annus Mirabilis of 1983, still define the theoretical gold standard. It is as if the theoretical clock of the field stopped in that year. Reviewing the contemporary literature on nationalism and populism, Roger Brubaker more recently claims that, quote, the big historical questions and the major answers to those questions have been staked out already by an earlier generation of maverick intellectuals, end quote. This scholarly reverence uncritically adopts key assumptions as if they had already been empirically corroborated. But what is striking about the contemporary literature on nationalism is how little we know, because much remains to be empirically validated and in a systematic way. Ultimately, we need to get the balance right between Gellner's dismissal of national navels and Smith's navel gazing, as it were, But the only way to do this is through systematic empirical research. I think here, unfortunately, we lost lots of pictures. Oh dear, these slides did not come through. Well, this is quite unfortunate. Do you have the other version, the Word version? I have two
Probably these.
presentations. I don't want to deprive you of the pretty pictures. So I mean, I'm old-fashioned, but not that old-fashioned. So if you could try to show the Word version, perhaps, or did you use the PDF? Or this is a good place to make a little pause anyway in the talk. I apologize for this. But
Is this one here? ABS lecture.
yes, try that. No. Did you, oh yes, one more. No. That. Oh, I see. Can you do the PDF instead? PDF should be better. Yes. There we go. Excellent. No, now we don't see anything here. I have nice pictures here, so that defeats the purpose. And full screen also good. And now the joke is that we only have one on it. Okay, but I think you can probably see reasonably well over that. Okay, thank you. So in systematic empirical research, this is precisely what my research group at ETH Zurich has been doing.
Come back.
Very good. Thanks to a generous ERC grant for a project called National State Transformation and Conflict, here I draw material from the book that John alluded to, that is going to be published with Cambridge University Press. Motivated, but by what has been called the return of geopolitics, following Putin's annexation of Crimea in 2014, this research effort tries to explain how ethnic nationalism threatens to undermine state borders and triggering conflict in today's world. Putin's full-fledged invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the eruption of violence in the Middle East in October of last year confirmed that attempts to sweep nationalism under the rug are futile. I guess I don't have to convince this audience of that. Ever since Metternich's failure to anticipate the revolutions of 1848 through Gorbachev's underestimating national secessionism in the USSR, and more recently Benjamin Netanyahu's disastrous attempt to have us ignore Palestinian nationalism, leaders around the world, and not only the leaders, of course, have paid dearly for their failure to appreciate the destructive force of nationalism. But it is not only politicians who exhibit blind spots. Ironically, the uncritically modernist constructivist consensus in the literature also blocks the full understanding of geopolitics. The vast body of scholarship covering nationalism has surprisingly little to say about its consequences. This applies to the sources of geopolitical instability since the French Revolution, which continues to disrupt the world. This lack of scholarly imagination can be traced to four pernicious biases. First, most studies generally fail to appreciate that nationalism is an inherently territorial phenomenon, thus making it difficult to analyze states and nations' external shape and conflict behavior relating to territory. And second, by focusing mostly on how states form nations rather than the other way around, conventional constructivist research suffers from methodological statism that obscures how nationalist mobilization transforms state borders. Third, returning to the Warwick debate, conventional modernist interpretations dismiss historical legacies as irrelevant to modern politics, despite their occurring prominently in nationalist politicians' claim-making and often focus on nationalist integration rather than on disintegration. Fourth, and finally, while theorists of nationalism propose broad and sweeping theories about the macro change, and countless studies have analyzed the specific cases of nationalism, systematic empirical macro analysis is still lagging far behind scholars' theoretical ambition. Thus, a complete understanding of how nationalism has transformed and is still transforming state borders and conflict patterns requires that we address all four research gaps. And now I will go through them in turn with the pretty pictures. Okay, so the literature's inability to fully account for the subversive power of nationalism derives from its failure to treat nationalism as an inherently territorial phenomenon. It is, of course, true that Gender defines nationalism as a doctrine that requires congruence between political and cultural borders, and argues that deviations from this ideal are likely to cause tensions. Nevertheless, Gender and most other leading scholars of nationalism do not follow up these crucial insights with a systematic account of how specific geographic configurations can be linked to mass-based political behavior, such as large-scale conflict. In a pioneering study, geographer James Anderson observes that a crucial aspect of nationalism, quote, which is often underemphasized, if not ignored, is nationalism's relationship to territory, and this, together with the related territoriality of the states, provides perhaps the most promising approach to constructing a general theoretical framework, end quote. Still, this invitation to theorize about along these lines has been ignored by virtually all scholars of nationalism ever since. One of the main reasons for nationalism scholars' lack of attention to territoriality relates to how geographic ideas became politically tainted during the first half of the 20th century. The work of prominent geographers such as Friedrich Ratzel and Halvor Mackinder was used to justify European colonialism around the world. Most notoriously, of course, this colonizing spirit served as inspiration for the school of geopolitics of Karl Haushofer and other German geographers who legitimized the Nazi quest for Lebensraum in Eastern Europe. What is missing then is a sustained analysis of nationalism as an explicitly spatial process that goes beyond its status as an abstract institutional principle. In fact, states and nations are inherently territorial entities, both in terms of their spatial boundedness and social control. Following Max Weber's classical definition, sovereignty entails that the modern state exercises unrivaled authority within its clearly demarcated territory. But in contrast to ethnic groups, nations, which Weber conceptualizes as culturally defined communities that possess or aspire to statehood, are also constituted by the territory. without an explicitly territorial approach to both states and nations, again, this congruence principle remains abstract and difficult to turn into empirically meaningful theory. Indeed, macro-level research focusing on the territorial aspects of nationalism remains very rare. Among the very few exceptions, Nader Shelev's work on homelands is notable because it conceptualizes and measures crucial nationalist phenomena with the help of math material and in-depth case studies, while establishing a statistical link to conflict behavior at the macro level. I told you I was going to add cool pictures. Whether recognizing the territorial nature of nationalist ideology or not, virtually all scholars of nationalism accept again this congruence principle. There are two main paths to nation-state convergence. Either national identities are brought in line with states through a process of right peopling, or the states themselves adjust to their respective nations in the process of right sizing, to use the terminology of Brandon O'Leary and his colleagues. The strongly constructivist tenor of the mainstream literature privileges right peopling over right sizing, because it views ethnic and nationalist identities as quite flexible and amenable to being manipulated by state leaders. Although there is no reason to question the basic insight about all nations being constructed, the academic consensus has in many cases turned into stale orthodoxy. This conception of the state resembles a lava lamp containing squishy, semi-fluid material. In reality, however, the ethnic stuff is often more like real lava, perfectly capable of deforming or even destroying the lamp. Nevertheless, the unreflecting lava lamp approach to nation building has reinforced a tendency to give causal priority to states over ethnic nations, as the latter are seen as valuable and subservient to contemporary material needs. As tersely put by Hobsbawm, quote, "For the purposes of analysis, nationalism comes before nations. Nations do not make states and nationalisms, but the other way around," end quote. To a significant degree, this analytical privatization reflects normative revulsion against nationalists' own argumentation and narratives, which are typically written off as primordialism. The P word is often used as an invective to undermine even moderate criticism of radically constructivist scholarship, rather than as an accurate characterization of such critique. Such superficial posturing frequently sets up a theoretical strawman with ritual references to Gears and Shields and putative primordialists. Closer scrutiny, however, reveals that these classical statements by no means endorse primordialist beliefs. Instead, their arguments render social actors' convictions. Capturing this nuance, Anthony B. Smith introduces the useful term participants primordialism, which helps support analysis of how nationalist claims are often predicated on real-world beliefs in ethnically defined essences. Furthermore, the seminal contributions from the 1980s shifted the attention from the study of ideas to a materialist and institutionalist perspective. In particular, the state-centric approach can be traced back to the influence of Marxist historical materialism in the work of Hobsbawm and other modernists. Even the liberal theorizing of gender reveals echoes of Marxist structural materialism. This materialist undercurrent continues to affect contemporary social science scholarship of nationalism, rather than acknowledging the emotional impact of deeply rooted symbolic and cultural values. Rationalist scholars view both ethnic and nationalist identities as little more than reflections of instrumental choices. In the focus on material motives and path, these scholars privilege the agency of the state over culturally defined non-state actors. Viewing national identities as constructed and fluid, they argue that state leaders are able to manipulate and assimilate their populations, if necessary, by resorting to coercive means such as ethnic cleansing. On this view, governments wield powerful instruments that influence the internal ethnic makeup of states within given borders. To the extent that nationalists plays a role in processes of state formation, it primarily reinforces state power through enhanced resource extraction and military mobilization within fixed borders. In short, the radical belief in the malleability of the ethnic and national identities leads most scholars of nationalism to focus on the right peopling of states rather than the right sizing. This could be labeled methodological statism, which stands for the tendency to naturalize the state in the social sciences. It is related to the less precise notion of methodological nationalism, which refers to the nationalization of the nation state. Less precise because it's very, very often unclear what people refer to when they talk about the nation state. Of course, all this does not mean that there is no literature on right sizing. Major studies have confronted the challenge of border change, both theoretically and empirically, as illustrated by work in political science by Ein Lustig and Nader Scheller and countless other people. Still, this border-changing nationalism remains an understudied topic that is in urgent need of conceptual integration. Nor does it imply that the right peopling is unimportant, since the 19th century determined governments have been able to manipulate the ethnic map, of course. Ultimately, the conventional constructivist literature on nationalism will fail to offer a complete understanding of the subversive and destabilizing impact of nationalism unless it backs out of the theoretical one-way street that restricts attention to states affecting nations rather than the reverse. An explicitly spatial perspective on state-nation congruence does not go far enough, however, for nationalism derives much of its power from comparisons with past configurations. As argued by Renan and Smith, nationalist politicians draw heavily on the past when they promote changes to state borders, whether such efforts concern states' territorial expansion or dismemberment. This brings us back to Gander's metaphorical neighbors. In their blanket dismissal of retrospective nationalism, many modernist scholars do not even try to gain a deeper understanding of how historical legacies affect nationalist identities and behavior. Geller and other modernists insist not only on nations' constructiveness, but also on the irrelevance of their pre-modern roots in today's world, as we've seen in Geller's quip about the navals. By stressing the constructed and historically contingent nature of modern nations, most recent studies of nationalism have followed in the footsteps of these seminal contributions. Rather than seeking the origins in historical legacies, the contemporary literature focuses on how modern states shape national identities through nation-building policies, thus conceptualizing not only nationalism but also nationalist conflict as exclusively modern phenomena. In contrast, Anthony D. Smith as well as other ethnosyndicalist sociologists, sociologists such as John Hutchinson, and several historians, including Christopher Bailey and John Conley, claim that there may be more continuity to national communities than assumed by the radical modernists. Again, returning to the Warwick debate, we need not ask whether nations existed in pre-modern times. Indeed, most scholars, including Gellner and Smith, would deny this, but rather whether historical legacies matter in the modern world. It could even be that the nationalists' retrospective illusions are mostly invented, but this creates a puzzle, because, as Smith insisted, it is hard to see how entirely mythical narratives could ever gain enough popular resonance to make a difference. The critical issue, then, is whether the myths are perceived to be true. This, however, requires a major shift in the literature, away from the radically modernist blanket dismissal of nationalists' retrospective claims to research that studies their factual basis. Any assessment of nationalism's destabilizing impact on geopolitics needs to find out under what conditions these myths become consequential. Indeed, backward-looking historical claims and revisionist conflict are inherent to nationalist politics. They cannot be viewed as something that vanished with the disintegration of the great empires in the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union presumably being the final nail in the imperialist coffin. Having considered three theoretical difficulties that obscure the order-transforming and violence-generating impact of nationalism, it is time to consider an empirical challenge. In contrast to Karl Deutsch, who pioneered the statistical analysis of nation building and nationalism in the 1950s and 60s, the seminal literature from the 1980s painted history with a broad essayist brush. All the same, there is an entire library filled with empirical studies of nationalist politics, going beyond the rather schematic and unsystematic use of historical evidence in the classical contributions from 1983. Several major macro studies trace the evolution of nationalist identity formation of specific countries, either as the qualitative comparisons by John Bruley, Michael Hechter, or Miroslav Roch, or by focusing on specific states, as Eugene Weber's seminal study of France, or Linda Coley's classic book, Britons. Much of the recent work has turned to micro-level analysis of single countries, however, focusing on how specific educational, linguistic, religious, and state-building efforts succeeded or backfired in various settings. Moreover, scholars have started going beyond identity formation and nation building as the main outcome, turning to mass-based politics, the mass-based politics of nationalism. In this area, however, the literature remains fragmented into sub-literatures that cover specific outcomes such as secession, unification, or identities. Most studies that investigate the link between nationalism and violence are based on qualitative analysis, as illustrated by important sociological studies by Michael Mann, Sinisa Malisevic, and John Hutchinson. Among the few who rely on statistical data, Mark Beisinger's pioneering study stands out. It analyzes how nationalist mobilization contributed to the collapse of the USSR, relying on extensive qualitative and quantitative evidence. From a broadly comparative perspective, Andreas Wimmer and his colleagues produced the most ambitious statistical studies of nationalism's consequences. Yet, by focusing on the counter level, they are forced to make several analytical assumptions that prevent them from addressing the issues relating to border change and right-sizing, and the right-sizing on the state. In fact, this research suffers from all three theoretical weaknesses that I just covered. First, instead of offering explicit spatial analysis of state and ethnic boundaries, these studies rely on highly aggregated non-spatial country-level data. Second, much of this research relies on data that are collected using the territory of backward projected contemporary states as the unit of analysis. While simplifying data collection, this approach is explicitly state-centric, while introducing hindsight bias and obscuring the tracing of actual changes in state borders over time. And third, the theoretical approach harks back to the radical modernism of classical modernization theory. According to the diffusionist model of Wimmer and his colleagues, virtually all units become nation-states sooner or later, and once this happens, they remain so forever. In summary, I have discussed 4 obstacles that stand in the way of a full appreciation of nationalism's geopolitical repercussions, namely non-spatial theorizing, methodological statism, a historical modernism, and incomplete validation. Thus, existing macro perspectives on nationalism offer either schematic or limited empirical coverage, or they fail to overcome the theoretical obstacles that I have outlined above. What can be done to overcome these obstacles? To be more concrete, I will return to the NASA project in order to illustrate how each of these difficulties can be addressed. Ultimately, the goal is to gain a better understanding of the geopolitical challenges of the early 21st century by analyzing how nationalism has transformed the state and continues to do so. The first theoretical step introduces an explicitly territorial perspective on nationalism. Indeed, Gellner's congruence principle makes little sense unless both states and nations are conceptualized as spatially bounded entities. Because the modern state is by definition territorial, and any other entity that aspires to be congruent with it must at least aspire to territoriality. Thus, in its pure form, nationalism entails a logic of double territoriality, both with respect to states and nations. Within this explicitly spatial perspective, we can now turn to the consequences of violating the nationality principle. Gellner identifies 2 main types of violation of the nation-state ideal. In essence, nationalism, quote, requires that ethnic boundaries should not cut across political ones, and in particular that ethnic boundaries within a given state should not separate the power holders from the rest. End quote. If the former situation features nations divided by state borders, the latter captures states that are split by ethnic boundaries and in which one ethnic group dominates the others. The ideal typical nation-state requires the absence of both of these violations. Full nationalist congruence only holds if national unity and home rule are achieved in a single sovereign state. Confronted with violations of self-determination through alien rule, nationalists are likely to hold grievances that may lead them to question existing state borders in favor of secession. Likewise, division of the nation increases the probability of nationalist calls for unification and incorporation of nationalist kin. Given the crucial role played by Gellner's congruence principle, empirical analysis calls for spatial representations of territorial boundaries of both states and ethnic nations. Our approach is to digitize historical maps. The NASDAQ project relies on our own and other state maps. In addition, charting ethnic settlements in Europe from the 19th century required a major effort to digitize and integrate a large number of historical ethnic maps. As we have seen, violations of Gellner's congruence principle can be reversed in two ways. Either state borders have to adjust to ethnic settlements or vice versa. This is what I have referred to as the state's right sizing and respectively right peopling, without any normative implications, of course. While right peopling is no doubt very important, the main focus of our research has been on right sizing. Far from being marginal in Europe, changes to state borders were at least as important as modifications of ethnic boundaries in modern history. The former process requires that ethnically defined nations are powerful enough to right-size states' territories while mustering resistance to states' attempts to reshape them. Crucially, the focus of the locus of agency does not merely lie in the government, but may also be invested in non-state actors, such as nationalist movements seeking rather than already possessing statehood. Driven by the desire for state-nation convergence, nationalists attempt to implement border change through specific processes, namely secession, unification, and irredentism. Based on this logic, our empirical research addresses the puzzling decline of state size that started in the late 19th century, following centuries of state growth. In a recently published article, I and my co-authors confirmed that while ethnically split states tend to experience secession, ethnic groups fragmented into separate jurisdictions typically generate demands for unification and irredentism. Representing a combination of secession and unification, irredentism presupposes that both states and ethnic nations are fragmented. The spatial approach allows us to identify all ethno-nationalist border changes in Europe since the Napoleonic Wars. Red bars stand for secession, green bars for unification, and orange ones for irredentism. Given the shift to red bars away from green ones, we conclude that nationalism is the main reason why states have got smaller, not only in Europe, but in fact around the world. In a related study, the same team of authors, here led by Carl Müller-Crepon, a former PhD student at now at the LSE, compares the effect of ethnicity on border locations with non-ethnic geopolitical factors such as rivers and mountainous terrain. The model represents Europe as a lattice of points between which there may or may not be a state border. This analysis confirms that, at least in Europe, changing state borders aligning with underlying ethnic identification patterns have made a major contribution to state-nation convergence over the last two past centuries. In yet another paper, I and my co-authors identify specific configurations within which conflict becomes likely. Persistent efforts to eliminate violations of the nationalist principle have been the leading cause of both civil and interstate conflict since the French Revolution. While unification processes tend to be more peaceful. It tends to break away territory from states, usually trigger violent reactions defending territorial integrity, as shown by Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-blown invasion of Ukraine in 2022, situations that feature ethnic settlements spilling over state borders are especially prone to separatism, irredentism, and interstate war. As an additional crucial step, we extend the spatial perspective to an explicitly spatial temporal one, because nations' putative ethnic roots typically play an important role in their self-definitions. Echoing Ernest Renan, geographer James Anderson captures this logic well. Quote, as well as being both unifying and divisive over space, nationalism is also Janus space with respect to time, simultaneously backward-looking and forward-looking. A remote past, typically a fabricated heroic version of it, is used to highlight the inadequacies of the recent past and the present in order to point toward and mobilize support for the progress to a supposedly better future. End quote. This analytical extension does not in any way reject the modernist conception of nations as relatively recent constructs that emerged after the French Revolution. It does suggest, however, that nations were rarely constructed ex nihilo, as Anthony Smith used to say. Instead of merely fabricating narratives, nationalist entrepreneurs rely on so-called usable history, rather than focusing on debunking historical myths and distortions. Then we need to identify how nationalist grievances are formulated as perceived violations of the nationalist principle in relation to what Smith calls past golden ages. Golden ages are historical periods that can plausibly be portrayed as times of national power and unity. Sometimes these high points were interrupted by historical trauma, for instance, conquest and occupations, or the splintering of the national community into separate polities. Temporal comparisons of this type often refer to recent history as Putin's bemoaning the fragmentation of the Russian nation into post-Soviet republics. In some cases, however, they reach a long way back in history, as illustrated again by Putin's frequent references to Peter the Great, as well as the Serbs' long-held frustration with Ottoman occupation from the Battle of the Blackbirds in Polje, Kosovo in the 14th century. By constructing long-term continuity of our people throughout the centuries, nationalist educators, intellectuals, and historians create a three-step narrative sequence that starts with the Golden Age, followed by a reversal that initiates the Dark Ages, ending with a call to action which aims at restoring the nation. Specifically, this type of restorative nationalism seeks to overcome alien rule and or division, which can be easily contrasted to supposedly independent and united episodes in the past, as long as peoplehood is projected backward based on what are often historically dubious but frequently held assumptions about ethnic descent and continuity. As illustrated by Gender's provocative reference to the navels of nations, modernists do not deny that nationalists appeal to prior history. but they do question whether such appeals have a lasting effect. Or as John Brewley puts it, quote, "It is of course true that nationalist intellectuals and politicians seize upon myths and symbols inherited from the past and weave these into arguments designed to promote national identity and justify nationalist claims. However, it is very difficult to correlate their degree of success with the objective importance of such myths and symbols." End quote. In a recent article, I, together with Yannick Pengel, Luc Jardin, and Carmen de Crepon, operationalize such objective importance of nationalist claims with their conflict-inducing effect in modern times. Our analysis shows that incongruent borders are more likely to be contested by violent means, where nationalist rulers are able to contrast current division and a rule with supposedly more unified and independent golden ages in the past. Focusing on territorial claims and conflict in post-Napoleonic Europe, this research expects nationalists to be more likely to mobilize and initiate conflict if they can contrast their status, the status quo, to a historical polity with supposedly greater national unity and or independence. Based on European state borders going back to 1100, combined with spatial data covering ethnic settlement areas during the past 2 centuries, we found that the availability of plausible golden ages significantly increases the risk of both domestic and interstate conflict. These findings suggest that specific historical legacies make some modern nationalisms more consequential than others. Indeed, European states have been more likely to make territorial claims and fight against neighbors posing powerless ethnic kin when past state borders incorporated larger parts of territory currently inhabited by the ethnic nation than the contemporary Roman state. Putin has repeatedly lamented Russia's lost unity resulting from the breakup of the Soviet Union, and his essays and speeches reveal the motivation to restore Tsarist imperial glory. He and many other nationalist leaders go back centuries to unearth medieval kingdoms, early modern territorial states, or empires that allegedly satisfied the nationalist ideals of ethnic unity and home rule. Projecting modern notions of national consciousness onto pre-modern populations and constructing unbroken lines of continuity across centuries, restorative nationalism thus blends historical fact and fiction into self-serving narratives aimed at contemporary audiences. The spatial-temporal perspective also allows us to study reactive nationalism. Whereas naive modernization theories expect assimilating states to prevail, we follow the lead of more subtle modernist approaches that consider the possibility of backlashes. In a team of authors led by Yannick Pengel, we use the gradual expansion of the European railway network from the 19th into the 20th century to investigate how this key technological driver of modernization affected ethnic separatism. Combining new historical data on ethnic settlements, areas, conflict, and railway construction, this study tests whether railroads triggered separatism among peripheral ethnic groups. We're actually drawing on data from the two train spotters and train spotting enthusiasts in France, and we geocoded everything. I never thought that in my academic life I would go back to modern railways, but here I am. And they did a fantastic job, by the way. Never underestimate the train spotters. On the average, railway-based modernization increased separatist mobilization and secession. These effects concentrate in countries with large ethnic minorities, weak state capacity, and low levels of economic development and democracy. Overall, these findings call for a more nuanced understanding of the effects of European modernization on nation building than is offered by the conventional literature, which has arguably been too influenced by Eugene Weber's seminal study Peasants into Frenchmen. Let me now conclude this lecture by considering what we have hopefully learned. Going back to the Warwick debate, it is time to ask who was right. Was it Smith or Gellner? I'm afraid rather than choosing a winner, I will have to split the difference between the two scholars. And I don't want the civil war to break out in the nationalist studies community either. Clearly, Gellner's reference to irrelevant navels overstated his point for rhetorical effect. And indeed, he was brilliant. Upon further reflection, however, his position appears more nuanced, perhaps even somewhat contradictory. Against the great integrating force of industrialization, Gellner puts the Ruritanians with their entropy-resistant traits blocking nation building, although the conditions of reactive nationalism remains less clear. In fact, Gellner and other constructivists are much more interested in the acts of invention than sources of historical persistence. Does that imply that Smith came closer to the truth? It depends on whether you take Gellner's more provocative claims as a reference point, or his more modest, albeit somewhat contradictory qualifications. Certainly, with some help from Gellner, Smith sometimes created the theoretical straw man out of the modernist position. And his ethno-symbolist interpretation often leans too heavily in the direction of historical determinism, although John has disabused me of believing that it was fully determinist. While ethno-symbolists do not necessarily believe in unbroken continuity from ethnic cause to successful nation building in the modern world, they tend to underestimate evolutionary sources of change, including intermarriage, but also nationalist creativity in their selective use of history, going backwards, not forwards, most recently illustrated by Cooper's historical monologues. Typically, creative nationalists mix relatively robust facts relating to historical precursor states, power, and borders based on retrospective projections of modern ethno-nationalist identities onto pre-modern political entities which were often more multi-ethnic and detached from ethnically distinct masses than claimed. But again, historical veracity is not the key. Rather, whether enough people ended up believing in the myths, and this requires there to be at least the kernel of truth. What our research shows is that whether entirely historically accurate or not, backward projection of this type makes a difference to warfare during the two past centuries in European history. More generally, however, there is an urgent need to shift the dial in the ethno-symbolist direction, namely as regards the central role played by history in nationalist ideology. We have to take it seriously. Contrary to modernist beliefs, historical narratives are not merely ornate rationalizations of a mostly materialist reality. Rather, they can take on such an importance that many are ready to sacrifice their lives for the national community. An equally important conclusion for the field of nationalist studies is to encourage more systematic comparative research that takes history seriously. Following the lead of Karl Deutsch, our emphasis, our empirical research illustrates what can be done with historical maps and contemporary spatial statistics. Yet, I'm not arguing that our map-based macro approach is the final word on the matter, far from it. There is an urgent need for systematic studies of nationalist narratives and their impacts. Indeed, instead of dismissing nationalist historical claims, we need to dissect them. Such research will have to draw on a variety of information sources and methods, some quantitative, supported by text processing tools, while others entirely qualitative and historical, drawn from various sources, including archival research. It's really too bad we couldn't do this lecture in the amphitheater, the anatomic amphitheater, when I'm urging us all to dissect these ethno-nationalist narratives. At the end of this lecture, there is no time for extensive policy recommendations. I will limit myself to two brief points. The first one is that many observers, especially in the West, keep underestimating the geopolitically destabilizing force of nationalism. The liberal belief in a globalized, borderless world may have faded somewhat from its peak in the early 2000s, but materialist and individualist beliefs still blind liberal observers to the ideological projects of nationalist politicians on a mission, be it Putin, Erdogan, or Netanyahu. By the way, I was sitting next to a colleague at the dinner and an economist, and he said that, of course, Putin is not going to take over the rest of Ukraine. So I guess there is still room to learn on that front. From Metternich to Mearsheimer, the methodological statism hardwired into realpolitik also gets nationalism wrong. As a result, many policymakers and scholars were as surprised by Russia's attack on Ukraine in 2022 as the previous generation was by the collapse of the Soviet Union. The proper theory of world politics that integrates nationalism into its very core promises to make geopolitical surprises a bit less surprising. Let me stress one more point before closing. It would be wrong to conclude that just because alien rule tends to trigger conflict, this means that the best or even the only solution is to follow the nationalists and redraw borders through state partition. Although the two-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict may offer the least unrealistic way to end what appears to be an endless conflict, in most other cases, it is also possible to alleviate foreign rule through compromises based on governmental and territorial power sharing. The final empirical research paper in our project it finds that although partitioning of states can reduce conflict by solving nationality problems, it may also create new cases of dominance and even interstate disputes involving the separated entities. Thus, although nationalists are to be taken seriously, it does not mean that one should endorse their preferred way of solving conflicts, be it through political domination, as Bibi Netanyahu prefers right now, or territorial dismemberment of the polity in question. As shown by the Northern Ireland, territorial compromises are rarely impossible and usually preferable. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a most fascinating lecture. We now have a reception, and no doubt there will be many questions.
Hopefully critical ones.
Yes, yes. And we will be led